The following program is an independent production, apart from DJDP Productions. The views, opinions, and ideas of the producers of The Darkest Hour do not necessarily reflect those of the staff of DJDP Productions, its partners or affiliates. The producers of The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane of Forget Me Not assume all responsibility for the content of its program. Should you have questions or concerns regarding The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane, please contact the producers directly. Or you may also contact the staff at Neo Retro FM through email at djdphoenix@protonmail.com. Be sure to include the date of the program and the subject matter you're inquiring about. And now, Neo Retro FM presents The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane, streamed live from Marysville, Washington.
For tomorrow, we embark on the darkest hour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Have you ever experienced something that changed you? An experience that made such an impact on you that you found your whole life's trajectory changing right before your eyes? It's a fact that not all these life-changing experiences are spooky. But it's also a fact that some of them are downright terrifying. So, let's get started, shall we? This was about 15 years ago, when I decided that it would be cool to work as a bouncer for a local venue. I'm a big guy who had a whole lot of anger issues, I'll admit it. But this made me a prime candidate for club bouncer, and apparently a prime candidate for some pretty negative stuff too. Attracting things that are attracted to that kind of energy. You're gonna die. Those were the last words I heard before suddenly I was unconscious. My next come-to moment would be 3 other dudes standing over me, asking if I'm okay, saying an ambulance was on the way, telling me, don't move, and then I'm out again. So, let's step back a minute to before all of that. I've been living with my mom as I had most of my life, up until she passed in 2017. She had been diagnosed with MS just after I was born, so I'd been taking care of her for quite some time. However, at this time, when the event took place, she was relatively mobile and only in the early stages of decline. My mom definitely treated me like a child all of my life, even as a 29-year-old man. But what can I say? I was her only child, and as I stated before, I lived with her for as long as I'd existed. She'd pack me a lunch every day. I know, cute, right? Well, she'd always pack the same few things, and I wasn't complaining. One day at the club, I went to grab my lunch from the fridge for my break, and it wasn't there. Naturally, I went nuts. Again, my anger wasn't managed at this point. I was still working through a lot of shit. So, I go around, asking every chump in the building if he's seen my lunch, what the hell they did with it. Each individual giving me a quick answer of, I have no idea, or, I never mess with your food, man. There was also my favorite at the time, which was, I didn't take your lunch, but you can punch me anyways. That made me laugh, but I was still pissed. Honestly, who takes someone's lunch? It has my name on it, I would think. Over the years, I learned that a lot of people actually do this. It's like a weird office thing where people eat shit that isn't theirs, and then watch as the drama unfolds. Weirdos. Well, this went on for days, to the point where I just stopped bringing my lunch inside. Instead, I got a portable cooler to keep in my car, and I cursed everyone inside that building when I did. So, the day that I decided to make these changes, something else happened. I kept my lunch in the car, and I head to the building. The way these venues work is they typically aren't open in the day. Maybe the bar section, but you only need a bouncer past 7 p.m. when doors open. Sometimes I'd be the first to arrive and would have to unlock the main doors. Or there'd be a bartender on staff, and I could enter through the bar. Today, there was no bartender. I knocked a few times, like they suggested, but still nothing. So I decided to unlock the main entrance to head inside. It was starting to be dark, but from the window inside the venue on the back wall, you could see the dusk light coming through the building from the door that I was standing at. As I go to unlock the door, it looks like a person runs from one end of the bar to the next. I can't see anything other than a shadow as it passes by the window, affecting the light shining in. My angry brain kicks in, and my first thought is, why the hell didn't you just open the door for me? Clearly, I am me, and clearly, I was knocking. Over it entirely, I decided to just unlock the door. The moment I step inside, I'm confronted with a sort of cold front. My arms, my legs, everything's covered in goosebumps. Even though this is strange, it doesn't stop me from continuing forward to get the lights. These lights are connected to a huge circuit board. There's one switch and it lights up the whole place. Then we have stage lights, separate from the main light. Bouncers don't usually get involved in sound or electrical setup, so we just use the one main switch. In fact, to set up the stage lights, you need a master key, and it's electronic. So there isn't a way for anyone to just turn these lights on. I hit the big switch and nothing happens. I do this repeatedly until my fingers hurt, and I've concluded I'm getting nowhere with this flicking method. I know the breaker is in the basement, so I head that way. It's not super scary. Well, I mean it is, it's a basement, and all basements are scary, but it was also the break room. You know, where lunch thieves hang out? Well, I make my way to the basement staircase, and just as I'm about to head down the stairs, I see something at the bottom. It's the outline of a person, but they're completely dark. I grab my belt flashlight and I shine it down the stairs where I see nothing. I pull the light away. Shadow person is still there. I find myself doing the same thing I did with the light switch, angrily going from on and off and repeat. Like a lot of things during that time, I was over it pretty quick. I put my flashlight back in my belt and just headed right down the stairs. As I did, I watched this literal shadow suddenly rush past me. It wasn't a person, but yet I felt moved, taken aback, literally, a step. Like a gust of strong wind just messed up my balance for a second. I turned to follow it with my eyes, but it was gone. This is where I feel some of that anger turn into fear. Up to that point, I'd maintained that someone was messing with me, or someone was in the building that shouldn't be. But I just watched something run by me that was actually no one. So I was having a hard time in that moment, figuring out my next steps. And I was half sitting on the steps, but I stood up and continued down. Halfway down, I can see all the lights suddenly turn on. Not just the main ones, but the stage lights too. So I turn around, almost more confused than scared. I'm cursing something under my breath, when suddenly I hear in my right ear a voice, clear as day, whisper, "You're gonna die." And before I know it, I can feel myself being hauled backwards down the stairs. I tried to brace myself at first and successfully didn't hit my head, but I was still falling, and the last thing I see is that same shadow, now standing atop the stairs. A loud noise, and then flash to my next come-to moment. The one with all the dudes over me, telling me not to move. And quickly realizing that I couldn't anyways, so I passed out again. The ambulance ride is a blur. The hospital day one is a blur. It's not even until 3 days after this whole event that I start to recall all of these details. I didn't bother telling doctors and nurses that I was thrown down the stairs by an entity, because that seemed crazy, even if it was true. Regardless of how it happened, the end result was that I had broken my neck. which at the time I didn't even know was possible to do without a guarantee of death. But there I was, all broken but alive. I found myself actually thanking this spirit. I could remember the day clearly now, and I felt like even if they were trying to harm me, I had survived somehow, and I was grateful. All I could think about was how angry I didn't feel about any of this. It's hard to explain, but I was the kind of guy who, if something happened to me that was unfavorable, and I'm talking small stuff, I was angry. Big stuff, I was just angrier. But I sat there in the hospital bed for almost 2 weeks, and something changed. Something within me. I didn't feel like I was controlling it 100% at first, but I seized it. I held on to it like I used to hang on to my anger. And I've walked with it ever since. Life is lighter without anger. I won't go into all the humanizing details of why I was a certain way, because that's what therapists are for. But I will say that there's something about anger, about hopelessness, that seems to attract more of it. And look, maybe that building was occupied by something before I even started there. But it felt like something was targeting me. And I'm inclined to think it's because of that awful energy that only I seemed to pack up and take with me everywhere I went, carrying it around like it was as much a part of me as my own limbs. Sometimes I wonder if I was meant to die that day. But what keeps me going is knowing that even if that's the case, I didn't die. And therefore, I choose not to live like a dead man or an angry one. Oh, by the way, when I got into my car for the first time in weeks, it was locked, but my lunch was missing. I'm still undecided on that one. Was it a thief of a spirit, saying one last ha-ha? Or did someone seriously take my lunch while I was in the hospital? Either way, I'm not angry about it anymore. So, it's just another thing to smile about. So this just happened a few nights ago, around midnight. I was doing my usual bedtime routine, brushing my teeth, washing my face, just getting ready for bed. My mom was asleep in her bedroom, which is pretty far away from the bathroom itself. Randomly, I felt this tap on my shoulder. It tapped twice, like one would do to get your attention. I turned around thinking it was my mother, but as I did, I could still hear her snoring in her room. There was no one there. I felt myself being covered in chills. Then, once I turned back around, I saw nothing there either. But the tapping, it wouldn't stop. It kept going, and harder. In a panic, I tried to swat at whatever was tapping my shoulder, but it kept tapping. I found myself moving around like crazy, as if I was trying to get away from a bee. And eventually, when I couldn't get it to stop, I ran out and screamed for my mom. When my mom ran out of her room, I ushered her to the bathroom, staying a bit behind her and telling her that something had been tapping my shoulder excessively. I did notice in that moment that it had stopped. Obviously, my mom was confused, and I didn't have any evidence to produce. So we ended up going back to our respective bedrooms for the night. I couldn't sleep that night, I was too scared. And ever since then, my sleeping's been totally messed up. I find myself getting a maximum of 3 hours each night. My home is one that was built in the last 4 years. We're the first ones to own it, to live in it. I guess really I'm less interested in what it is and more interested in how to make it go away. In dreams, the interactions and settings are often stitched similar to a fragile quilt. Memories crudely sewn together, tattered pieces of cloth familiar to the touch, forming a unit unquestioned of flaws. Only with closer examination do the patterns feel misplaced. Like this, as consciousness takes hold, the details of dreams are forgotten, torn and abandoned, quickly replaced with thoughts of what the new day will bring. But in my dreams, there's a town that I visit from time to time that has never changed. Though I've never been to this place in real life, in my dreams, I've walked each sidewalk enough to remember it as if I have. The town's layout became vivid, not through the fabric of memory, but through the hours of exploration I've managed to accumulate while amidst my slumber. From the ice cream parlor with the neon blue trim to the fountain at the roundabout, every brick remains untouched by alterations. To this day, I find myself wandering the shops and walking the town's park multiple times a month, usually with a nondescript purpose, or at least one not worthy of remembering past the morning. But where I was and where I went are like thoughts from a prior day when recalled. Talking to my wife, I was surprised to hear that my descriptions of reoccurrences in detail aren't frequent with others. The news of this scared me and dwindled my hopes of relatability, so much so that I didn't bother furthering the reason I mentioned my dream to begin with. What I failed to explain was that although the town around me has stayed the same, I've also recently started having multiple encounters with the same person. My attention to their presence defined amongst the nameless faces that pass through occupancy without notice. The first time we met, she was dressed as a postal worker. She introduced herself, but it was only the second time that we made contact I'd remember her name. This time, she was dressed as an ice cream worker at the parlor. Approaching the counter, she says, "You're back. Remember me from last time?" I pause, study her features. I can't help but feel like I do somehow remember this person. She says, "It's Nora." Immersed in a dream state, all of this seemed correct. It's only when I woke up did her question, "Remember me from last time?" really trigger an unnerve within. Eventually, this sensation dulled as the weeks would pass and my mind again piled up with other thoughts to focus on. My third encounter with Nora was in June. When I saw her, she was wearing a black dress and sitting on a wooden bench across the street from the fountain. I sat down beside her, and Nora tells me there was a funeral today for a member of the community. She says they held a beautiful service and buried him in the cemetery near the park. I say my condolences while also thinking, there's never been a cemetery here. But today, sitting next to Nora, past the fountain, across the street, and just beyond the grass playfield, I see a cemetery in the distance. In pure astonishment, I stand up and begin to make my way across the street. Nora follows closely behind. While using the crosswalks, I notice other townspeople have stopped in place, frozen in what they were doing, but all now glaring at us as we went by. A dog outside the barber shop stands growling, but its body completely still, unshaken by the low vibrations it's expelling. I mention my observation to Nora, and she says, "They're not glaring at us. They're glaring at you, Oliver. They were hurt you didn't attend the funeral. Some are even saying that you did it." I'm awoken by a paw gently patting my face and the meows of my cat eager for breakfast. I'm exhausted the following day, forced to live again on another planes of existence, as if my time asleep was marked invalid by Nora. It would be a month before I found myself returning to the town. It was nighttime there, and the fountain at the roundabout no longer had water spitting from its tiered levels. It was dry, barren of any movement. like the streets surrounding it. I didn't want to be here anymore. The town I once knew to be a warm escape from reality has now become cold and desolate. While I was gone, it looks like Nora's influence had filled the atmosphere. But where had I gone? How could such drastic changes be made without my knowledge? Was I no longer the carpenter of my own thoughts? Were the blueprints of dreams I construct being altered? Altered by another conscious being, sharing the same frequencies as mine? I needed to find Nora. My pace turned into a run as I started frantically going from shop window to shop window, peering in for any sign of her. I didn't have to look far. I saw a glow coming from the graveyard. As I approached, I slowed my run. There was Nora, along with the rest of the townspeople. That glow that I saw was being made by the torches and flashlights the townspeople held while listening to her preach. The closer I got, her shouts became more audible. Then, she extends her arm over the crowd and points in my direction, yelling,
"There he is. Don't let the murderer get away."
In a synchronized spin, the mob turns to face me. There's nowhere to hide, and that fact makes itself known when the white beam of flashlight washes over me. Blinded, I lift my hand to shade the light from my eyes. I hear footsteps charging me, furiously gaining in remoteness to my position. Again, I run, but this time, my attention is focused on a place to hide. Nora has turned this town against me, but I don't have time to unpack these theories now. I try the door handle to the first shop I reach, and it's unlocked. I dive in and shut the door behind me, trying to make myself as small as possible behind the counter. On my hands and knees, torches make shadows dance across the walls as the crowds chant and scour the area. Cautiously, I lean my head out just enough so that I can see the front window. I watch groups pass by. The ones that weren't holding lights had weapons, and they held on to them tightly. There wasn't a doubt in my mind. If they got a hold of me, they were going to kill me. Orchestrated symphonic bloodshed, being conducted by Nora. Returning to my position behind the counter, I quickly assess the shop has one door in and one door out. If I'm spotted, there's no back exit for me to flee, and considering the constant mob of traffic passing by the front windows, it'll be nearly impossible to leave out that door unnoticed. But my time for planning was cut short, signaled by a ring. I hear the shop door slowly open, jostling the little brass bells stationed on top of its frame. Holding my breath, it sounds like only one pair of feet bending the floorboards as they begin to check corners of the shop. Using the wood creaks as a guide, I track their proximity, and when they start getting closer to the counter, I crawl opposite of their perceived trajectory. The only advantage I have in this situation is surprise. In what manner I utilize this is now detrimental to my survival. With an animalistic instinct, I hop up and I rush the man. Startled, and before he has time to react, my hands get a hold of his head, and I sink my thumbs into his eyes. He falls back, with me on top of him, his shriek abruptly silenced when the back of his skull hits the floor. My thumbs sink deeper as I grind my teeth and try to keep his head in between my hands, like a basketball, desperately trying to deflate the air inside. When his body lets out a final twitch, I roll off of him, feeling sick to my stomach, my hands wet from blood, my lungs burning from the adrenaline. The noise from the altercation surely alerted the others. Now, their accusations justifiably righteous to uphold. Just beside the lifeless body, I saw a meat cleaver. I wiped my bloody palms on my jeans and went to retrieve the blade from his hip. A shoelace is used to tie the meat cleaver to his wrist. Untying the knot, I fasten it to my own wrist and stay in the shadows while making my way to the front door. One last heavy breath of air enters and leaves my body while preparing to open the door and run for my life. To where? I don't know. The town I once knew now glows with a clarity unattached from safety. Reaching up, I hold the brass bell in my hand and open the door from under it. Exiting the shop, the door swings closed behind me, and before the bell has an opportunity to ring again, I'm already sprinting down the block. I hear a voice call out.
There he goes!
And the townspeople begin their chase. I'm like a fox in the hunt, their pursuit gaining on mine, only measured by volume, as I do not dare to sacrifice momentum for glancing over my shoulder. I reach the outskirts of the unnamed town, the point at which I always find myself arriving, but have never thought about turning around to see what was south. There's no slowing down as I cross the invisible border, separating the town and uncharted territory. In front of me, the road swallowed by a dense fog. Only now do I swiftly look back to see I'm no longer being chased. Instead, I see Nora, standing front and center at the town's border with the angry mob now behind her. No longer being chased, I turn around and face Nora from the fog. She smiles and says, "We'll get you next time." The fog engulfs me, and when I open my eyes again, I'm staring at the dark ceiling of my bedroom. My heart is racing, my pillow soaked in sweat. Looking over at the clock, it's around 4 a.m. My wife is still asleep next to me, but for obvious reasons, I'm unable to close my eyes. I stay awake and walk upstairs, marking the first of many sleepless nights and even more exhausted mornings. Since that night, I'm genuinely terrified to wake up and find myself back in that town with Nora. Fear of sleep is draining me. The tightly wound strings of my reality have frayed, no longer joining as one, both strands equally representing an unraveled end rather than a beginning. I'm at a loss for what to do next because it's not a question of if I go back, as much as it's a question of when. And more so, will I have the strength to defend myself next time? I think I saw a legitimate shapeshifter. I've shared my experience before in hopes that someone out there has an explanation, or maybe has had a similar experience. Well, here's the story. The experience took place during Thanksgiving break. The sighting was later in the evening at about 1 a.m. We'd rented a vacation home in Newport, Oregon, to accommodate not just mine but also my sister's family. They would be flying in later that day from Montana for Thanksgiving. And there would be quite a few of us, too many for my smaller home, which is in the southwest region of Washington state, closest to the Oregon border. We had all arrived at the property around 4 p.m., and at about 7:30, I hear my daughter start to yell for me from the back bedroom. I rushed over and she said that my 2-year-old grandson had gotten into a case with my blood pressure medication. She was worried that he took some. I counted, and sure enough, one of my pills was missing. Naturally, panic ensued, but not enough to distract us from calling poison control. My heart just about stopped when they told us to hang up and call 911 right away. When we did, they sent an ambulance and took my grandson to a small but close hospital in the area. My daughter and son-in-law rode in the ambulance, while I followed it to the hospital in my car. When I got there, we were informed that the hospital was not equipped for my grandson's situation, and that they'd be transporting him to Children's Hospital near Portland, So, on the eve of Thanksgiving, a pediatric ambulance transported my grandson from Newport to Portland. It's about a 2.5-hour drive in a regular car. The ambulance arrived around midnight to pick up my grandson. My daughter rode in the ambulance with him to Portland. Me and my son-in-law went back to the beach house to get a couple of things. Change of clothes, my grandson's blanket, and then we started the drive to Portland around 12:30 a.m. So here's where we encountered something that my son-in-law and I will never forget, yet we'll never really be able to explain either. We'd been on the road for a little over an hour and had just passed a casino on Highway 18. The area, which was just before McMinnville, was filled with hay farms and farmland. The road isn't incredibly well lit and has just 2 lanes. It's definitely a long, deserted road, especially at that hour. The ride had been very emotional. I had felt extreme guilt for having packed my meds in a tote bag where my grandson was able to easily access it. I was terrified for him and crying. My son-in-law was also upset, and although he was trying to hide it, I knew he blamed me. Anyway, here's the crazy part. I noticed my son-in-law slightly drifting in the road. He was falling asleep. More than once I asked him if he was okay to drive and to be cautious. He said he was fine, and he declined my offers to drive. However, I kept my eyes on him the whole time, only checking back to the road sometimes. We were driving down this road, going almost or just about 60 miles an hour, when in the distance, we both saw what at first we thought was a deer, running in our lane of the road. It was coming straight at us. But within a couple of seconds, we both realized that it wasn't a deer at all, but a large, golden-colored canine of sorts. Maybe even a wolf. About 250, 300 feet away at this point, it got closer fast. It had to have been moving at least the speed that we were. As it got to about 150 feet away, it leaped upwards, and right before our eyes, it morphed instantly into a giant white owl. The wingspan stretched past our lane of the road. When recounting the story to our family much later, we both estimated its wingspan was between 12 and 15 feet. It was enormous. As soon as we see that happening, my son-in-law yelled out, "What the hell is that?" and swerved the car to the left, trying to avoid hitting it. But as he did this, the owl immediately landed about 100 feet ahead of us, just on the shoulder of the road. As it landed, we saw it tuck its head and wings into its chest, like it was afraid or trying to hide. As we drove past it, I got a good look at it out the window. I could see that even with its head and wings tucked in, the creature still came up to about the bottom of the window on the Impala. It had the width of an oversized beach ball and was about 3 or 4 feet tall. If this was supposed to be just an owl, then it was a mind-blowingly big owl. Something to note is that right when this event happened, or right after, we both felt like we were in some sort of trance, the same sort of trance-like state. We didn't speak a word the entire rest of the drive, not until we got to the hospital. We had both lost all the feelings of tiredness and angst. They were replaced with a calm alertness and awareness. I found I wasn't even worried about my son-in-law's driving any longer. The memory of the experience was crystal clear, but the feeling of sheer awe did not hit us until driving back through the same area the next afternoon. It was like we suddenly both said, "Oh, and what the heck was that thing that we saw last night?" And then it all started pouring out of the two of us. My daughter was asking us questions about it, and we were exclaiming the exact same answers at the same time. It was amazing. We both agree that this seemed to be some sort of mythical creature or shapeshifter. We both also agree that whatever it was good, and it meant us no harm, and it may have been a guardian. Or maybe even more likely, it was something that we witnessed by accident, a fluke that maybe we weren't meant to see. Either way, just the fact that we both saw it, I feel extremely lucky to have seen proof with my own eyes that animal spirits or shapeshifters alike do in fact exist, and sometimes even on the same planes that we do.
It's down to this. You and Kathy are tied up. How much are you going to wager on your final spin, Jim?
Well, I bet it all, Don. Ha! We really need this money.
Well, I'm sure your family back home is rooting for you. Time to spin.
This one's for you, honey.
Ooh, looks like you landed on a commercial break and lost it all.
Neo Retro FM, live from Olympia, Washington. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Modern music programming. NeoRetroFM.com. Are you afraid of the dark? Well, don't be. Instead, grab yourself a candle. Not just any candle, though. Grab yourself a seance. Or pure hate. Decide for yourself as you browse. The Candle Collection by Forget Me Not. There's a little something for everyone. You'll see. Visit conductedbyforgetmenot.com to learn more about this collection.
Kathy, come on down. You're the winner.
Man, I won.
Tell her what she's won, Bob.
Hey, Kathy, you won some stories. Okay. That's nice. Thank you.
So, I'll give a little backstory on the home where these experiences took place. The house had some seriously abnormal energy. And what I mean by that is you always felt that overarching sense of worry, a pit in your stomach kind of worry. Almost like what guilt feels like, except you know that you've done nothing wrong, so why do you have this feeling eating at you? I didn't always identify it that way, but I started paying attention to how I would physically feel when I would leave my house. It was much better, like my stomach finally settled and my angst diminished. It got to the point where I would stay at friends' houses a lot, more often than at my own, rotating amongst friends as to not be a total bother on any which one. But this was much later in life. I'll start with the earliest experiences that I have. The ones where that overarching feeling was warranted with something tangible, like a vision or a sound. There are 2 apparitions I saw in the house that I remember most clearly, and one of them I saw frequently. But my first experience, I was little, maybe 7 or so, and this apparition only appeared to me this one time. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, likely to go to the bathroom, because I'd walked past our living room, where I saw a figure, just standing in the middle of the room, staring back at me. Its eyes were glowing. I recall trying to figure out which family member was awake and why their eyes were doing that. But then, the undeniable reality set in that this was not somebody that I knew. They were around the same height as me, so that ruled out my parents and my little sister who was just out of diapers. I remember the glowing eyes most, and thinking that its ears were too far apart and too big. It was standing, but it seemed a bit crooked, kind of hunched over to one side. It had sort of a meddlesome expression, tilting its head back and forth curiously. This was near Christmas, so I remember being able to brush it off as one of Santa's elves or something, and I felt kind of excited. We both stared at each other for a few more minutes, and I remember that excitement changed. I don't know what happened, but for the first time, I was struck with unease. A worrisome pit filled my stomach, and I scampered back to bed. To fall asleep and to move on in life, as a kid, I told myself that it was an elf, and the feeling that I'd gotten was because I wasn't supposed to see the elf. As I got older and thought back to this event, I felt rather unnerved. I still do, honestly. The second apparition, well, it was different. I was older, but it still especially scared me. Maybe because it was reoccurring. When I was about 10, I got my own room after sharing a room with my sister for a few years. My new room sat at the end of a very long hallway, with several closet doors on either side. There was a bathroom at the opposite end of this long hallway, and the way that it was positioned, in accordance to my room, was that if both doors were open, you could see the bathtub from my bedroom door, and vice versa. The first time I saw it, I was in my room, and at first I thought it was a reflection or a shadow. Then I realized that it was much darker than the shadows it was within. It was a figure, sitting upright and very still in the bathtub. I assumed its back was to me because I could see no features. It was either bald or had long black hair covering its skin. A slim, dark figure. A human-like frame, with what looked like shoulders on either side of its head. Even though I dismissed it that night, I would see it many more nights. Not only from my room, but sometimes even from the hallway, or in my periphs when passing the bathroom itself. I saw it so often that I started to dismiss it as something that my mind was creating, a trick of the light, or a lack of light. But I do remember thinking, how could I see something so many times but not really know what it looks like? At the time, I never did share these experiences with anyone inside my home or outside. I figured talking about it inside the house would make it worse if it was something bad. And talking about it outside the home, well, what if it started making my outside life like my inside life? I couldn't have that be the case. Years later, the bathroom was renovated, and once it was finished, not only was the bathtub no longer visible from my room, but I also never saw the figure again. Years later, my sister and I were reminiscing about our childhood home, years after we'd moved out. Mostly happy memories came about, but then we couldn't help but talk about the feeling of the house. And then she stopped me a moment, asking me, "Did you ever see a person sitting in that old bathtub?" As she described what she saw, I couldn't believe we'd seen the same thing all those years. So the figure in the tub was not a figment of my imagination. But what was it then? My family has a cabin up in the small mountains of the Wisconsin Dells. Now, 2 things before the story. I wasn't there for this trip, as it was a guy's trip, so this is my dad's story. 2, our cabin is most definitely haunted. Many people have died in or near this house. I don't know any of the crazy stories about these deaths, just that the home itself had been around for over 200 years, with many families having lived in it. A cabin to us, as my dad would say, but likely a main home and many other things for many other people in those 200 years. The city had tried to forge a history museum in these hills probably 5 years before my family owned the place. But that idea never came to fruition, as it actually made the city more money to keep the land as it was and to sell the homes occupying it. When we bought the cabin, my dad said that there was a shop in town that had a lot of old historical photos and history books about the area. He picked up quite a few, and over the years, we would look through these and imagine the ones that may have lived in our home. There were some photos that we found where it was obvious they were taken in our area. You couldn't see if it was our cabin exactly, since the other 8 on the hill were identical, but we thought that it was pretty cool and had several of those in frames or in albums throughout the cabin. Okay, the story. Around 5 years ago, a bunch of my guy family members got together to go legally hunting. My family mainly hunts deer, which are absolutely huge out there, but also wild turkeys. Yeah, it's totally a thing. maybe in other places too, but it's practically the most popular form of hunting in the state of Wisconsin. One of my dad's cousins has a house out there as well. It's a bit down the mountain from where our cabin was, closer to the roads and newer in design. Our cabin seemed to be the spot to go when it came to hunting and guy trips. Anyways, all the guys were sitting around the table, just relaxing, having some dinner. After dinner, my uncle said he was going to go get cleaned up, and he headed to the bathroom, which was upstairs. He did the typical use the bathroom, wash his hands, and then he went to shave. As he was shaving, he kept the sink running, and as he looked up for just a second, he could see that someone was behind him. Assuming it was my dad or someone else in the house, and he hadn't heard them come in, he thought not much of it, and he kept shaving. But then, he actually looked at the person in the mirror and could see that it wasn't our family. He then physically looked behind him, and there was no one there. Back to the mirror, and no one there either. My uncle says he finished shaving but was a bit spooked. So he decided to go back downstairs, where he told everyone what had happened. He described the looks of the man in the mirror. As he described the looks of the man in the mirror, my older cousin and my dad recognize what he's describing, and they smile at each other. Then my dad tells my cousin to grab the photo near the back door. My cousin then showed my uncle the photo, and my uncle pointed out that that was definitely the man he'd just seen. Except the man that he had just seen had been deceased for decades, since 1906 to be exact. Growing up, I didn't always like staying at my grandparents' house. If I did, I'd always try to get away with sleeping on the couch, even though they didn't like that. The thing is, there was something wrong with their guest room. Even before this event, I didn't like that room. It always gave me a really bad feeling. I couldn't explain it even as a child, now as an adult. But it also seemed to have shadow people. The best way I can explain this is that there was nothing in the room to make the shadows that would appear. And furthermore, there was nothing that would make these shadows move the way they did. Most of the time, I tried to ignore them, closing my eyes or turning on the lights and falling asleep that way. One night, I remember it was particularly hot, and I was tossing and turning a lot. At some point, I decided to poke my feet out from under the blankets at the bottom of the bed to cool down. I hadn't even really started to doze yet when I felt something grab my feet. I immediately jolted, but it felt like whatever had grabbed my feet was still holding them. I continued to struggle and reached over as far as I could to the bedside lamp. I turned it on. There was nothing. I could move my feet again, so I did. I moved them into the living room, onto the couch. And honestly, I never slept in that room again. And to this day, I can't sleep with my feet hanging off the bed or out of a blanket. Just creeps me out. When we were about 12 or 13, my cousin and I got a job working the regular paper route in our neighborhood. It was a great excuse to hang out all the time and to ride our bikes before the streets were crowded with morning bustle or afternoon traffic. We had quite a few old people who lived in our area, some of them even awake and sitting on their front porch, waiting for the paper. For these individuals, we'd often walk the paper right up to them. This was back in the 80s, so believe it or not, people actually wanted to talk to each other, and they welcomed someone bringing them a paper. Also, if you know anything about the job of a paperboy, it's that the real money comes from the tips. And on one street in particular, we had some really good tippers. And on that street, there was one woman, and though I don't recall her real name, she always told us to call her Miss Patty. And Miss Patty was an extra good tipper. Her tips alone probably helped my cousin and I save up for our new 10-speeds. Even as youngsters, though, we felt bad taking her money. But she made it clear that it was rude not to. So instead, my cousin and I would do other work for her. Miss Patty was more than a good tipper. She was awesome. She just didn't appear to have any family of her own. This is why my cousin and I would take out her trash, check her mail, do yard work during the summer months. It was refreshing to help somebody who was so nice. Not to mention, my grandma had passed away when I was very little, so Miss Patty sort of felt like the closest thing to one. So the story. It was a Saturday night and I was staying at my cousin's. The next morning, we'd be making our deliveries and collections. Like all paper boys, we kept a ledger. The ledger housed names of customers, tracked their payments, subscription details, and even when they'd be on vacation. We got excited when we saw that the next day, Sunday, was the day to collect down Miss Patty Street. That night, I had a strange and sad dream. I was riding my bike and I was alone. I remember thinking that the sky was very dark in my dream, like midnight versus pre-dawn. But I had all of my papers with me anyways. As I rode down the street, I felt the need to pedal faster and faster. In my dream, I was panicking with no inclination as to why. I stopped my bike as something told me that I'd reached my destination. When I looked up, I saw Miss Patty's house. But something was different about her house. It was all dark, except one light in the upstairs bedroom. I had never seen her home like this and instantly thought maybe I shouldn't be here at this time. Just as I went to pedal away, I felt an overwhelming sense of comfort wash over me. I sat on my bike and continued to look at the house that was playing Miss Patty's house. What I saw next, well, I see the front door open, and inside the door frame is Miss Patty. She's waving for me to come inside, and she has a plate of cookies, as she often did. I parked my bike, grabbed her paper, and ran up to the door. The details were fuzzy, like my mind was trying to recreate the scene around Miss Patty's house, but didn't quite have all the pieces available, and just did the best that it could. For example, her mailbox was actually on the sidewalk, but in this dream, it was attached to her door. Little strange things like that. As I met Miss Patty at the door, she asked me to sit down. We sat on the front porch like we often would on warm days, days when we had time to just be and didn't have to rush off to the next route. Miss Patty looked at me. She didn't look sad, but the energy was sad. I was worried about what she was going to tell me, even though she was smiling. "Do you think you could check on me, Sam? Do you think that you could call someone over here to the house?" I looked at her, confused, and then I asked her what she meant. Was she all right? She smiled and said, "Sam, you two are all I've got. Can you do this for me?" She grabbed my hand and smiled again, waiting for my response. I told her, of course I would always check on her. I felt myself explaining to her that she was all right, that I was with her right now, so nothing could be wrong. But before I could finish that storyline, I was hearing, "Wake up, dude, we gotta go." It was my cousin, and it was now time to head out for our deliveries. When we did, I didn't immediately tell my cousin about the dream, as I was still trying to digest it, and honestly, shake the eerie feeling that it had left me with. On our ride, I was happy that the sky looked normal, the appropriate pre-dawn that I was used to. We made our deliveries, and when we got to Miss Patty's house, I froze. My cousin was already starting to walk the paper up to her door, but I couldn't help but feel something was off. The same top bedroom light was on, the one from my dream. Had it always been on? Was it only something I noticed because I just had a dream where it was on? I double-checked her mailbox, and it was in the appropriate place. I was standing next to it on the sidewalk, looking from the room to my cousin. Her home was unusually dark. See, usually you'd be able to see the kitchen lights on. They would illuminate the whole front space, or at the very least, a porch light would be on. My cousin was knocking, but no response. He left the paper on the ledge of the porch and hurried back to his bike. I guess we can just come back and do collections later. Seems like Miss Patty's still asleep. Speaking of Miss Patty, I had the weirdest dream of her last night. I grabbed my cousin's shoulder because he wasn't looking at me at the time. Now he was. I asked him pretty seriously, "Did she talk to you in your dream?" He told me that he couldn't really remember what she said, but yeah, he saw her waving from her window. She was saying something, but he couldn't hear her. I asked if he walked up to the house, and he said, "Sort of, that's the weird thing. I went to walk up there, and then she told me to wait, to come back later." I stared at him, waiting for more. I don't remember anything else. It was just kind of weird. Felt real, you know? I told him that I did know. And then I told him about my dream. He was a little freaked out, and I was more than a little freaked out. We both decided that we had to get these papers delivered, but the next neighbor who was awake, we'd ask to use their phone. Eventually, we'd made it to someone's home that was awake. We explained that we just wanted to have somebody check on Miss Patty. She waited for us on Sunday, and today she wasn't there. This was the same story that we gave the police, who agreed to check on Miss Patty. They asked for our parents' contact information. We both provided our home phone numbers and then continued on the route. Later that day, we made our way back down Miss Patty's street. Collections were usually more successful if you waited until after church hours, when people would be home again. My cousin and I both stopped our bikes and looked at each other. There were ambulances and caution tape outside of Miss Patty's home. I felt a real heavy pit in my stomach, and then suddenly, I knew I was going to vomit. I threw my bike down, and I made my way to a nearby bush, where I proceeded to throw up. My cousin was still on his bike, staring at the caution tape and the ambulances. I made my way back and picked up my bike, telling my cousin that we should go home and talk to our parents. When we did, we learned that Miss Patty had suffered a massive heart attack sometime in the middle of the night. She lived alone, and it looked like it had happened as she was preparing for bed. The police told our parents, thank the two boys who made the call, saying that without that call, they weren't sure how long it would have taken for someone to find Miss Patty. I took this information with stride, went to my room, and let it all out. At 12 years old, I don't know that I had felt that kind of emotional pain. That pain, paired with the visions that I'd had in my dream, it honestly changed me. Maybe that's a bit of a dramatic way to say it, but it just changed my perspective, the way I thought in general at that age. I don't know if the experience meant anything or if it was nothing more than a crazy coincidence. Either way, Miss Patty and I had a connection, and I guess that sort of stuff doesn't just fade away in death. And perhaps, for a brief moment, the connection becomes even stronger. Well, friends, it's the end of the hour and the end of tonight's show. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to tune in every Friday night at 11 p.m. right here on neoretrofm.com. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on Reddit, AmandaJaneFMN. Stay spooky.